Hello and welcome to On Landscape webinar. We're talking to Doug Chinnery in the third episode of the creative landscape photography techniques, including intentional camera movement and multiple exposures. As you may have seen if you were looking at the latest issue, we did a video in Clumber Park where we tried out both techniques at various points and produced a range of shots, and a wonderful day it was too. And I think, Doug, you're going to go through these from blind, as it were, so you haven't had a good look through these yet.
That's right. I decided rather than sort of prepare some and do it all behind the scenes, and then this is one I made earlier, I thought I'd do this completely live without any preparation at all. So what I prepare in front of you now is completely unplanned, so whatever happens, it might be awful, it might work okay, but this will be exactly as I do it, as if I'd literally just loaded these images from the camera onto my computer, because I wanted people to get a feel of exactly what it's like to see these images coming in from the camera, to see the bad as well as the good, and also perhaps to get a feel as well for how I identify, out of all the rubbish that there is, and you'll see the rubbish amongst these images, how I identify the ones that I'll then experiment with and start to process to see if there is an image there that's worth working on.
Okay, don't forget, everybody who's listening in, if you want to ask any questions, you can use the chat window or questions window on the right hand side of the panel, and we'll try and fit them in between the sections that Doug's talking. I'll try and fit them in straight away. So yeah, take it away, Doug.
Okay, so all these shots that you're going to see this evening were taken on a Canon 5D Mark III, and if you've watched the video that we did a couple of weeks ago, these are the images that you saw me taking while the video was recording. So this is what I was actually doing that afternoon, and these images are completely untouched. These are just the raw files straight out of the camera, and I'm using Lightroom 5 here, but if you're using Lightroom 3, Lightroom 4, pretty much you're going to see very, very similar things with your software to what I'm doing here. I also might do one or two things in Photoshop CC as well, but if you're using CS3, 4, 5, 6, you won't need anything fancy from Photoshop CC to do what I'm doing here as well. So, or if you're using Photoshop Elements, you'll be able to do everything pretty much that I do here as well. So software really shouldn't be a restriction to you. The first thing I wanted to show you was, you can see the film strip along the bottom of the screen here. I'm just going to go through a few of the photographs and show you just how random the process is, and to show you a lot of the rubbish that the camera produces when you're doing ICM. So in Lightroom 5, if you've got the first picture selected down here on the film strip, I like to press the F key. You can't do this in Lightroom 4 and below, I don't think, but if you press the F key, you get the picture full screen with all the panels hidden, and this gets rid of all the clutter on the screen, which I really like. So I now can just see one image at a time on the film strip, and I can start to look at it, and this is where I go through my selection process. So I start to move using the arrow keys on the keyboard along the film strip now at the bottom of the screen, and I start to make decisions on the pictures as to whether I like them or not. And so a picture like this is, to me, clearly rubbish, and so I would just reject it, and I would start to move along, and as you can see, a lot of them are absolute rubbish. And then I might come to one that I feel maybe has got something, and I mark that by pressing the P key, and if I think it's got some potential, but it's probably not going to get processed, but I just want to hang on to it for the moment, I would mark it with the 3 key, which gives it 3 stars. If I'm quite excited about it and I'm almost certainly going to process it, I will press the 4 key, and that 4 will give it 4 stars. And then I just carry on going through. And so as I go through the pictures, as I come to ones that I think have got something about them, I will mark up. And I'm just going to mark up a few with 4 stars just for the sake of this demonstration as we go through. But as you can see, there are some which have got potential, but there's an awful lot that are just shockingly bad. These ones are taken with the multiple exposure technique, with the lights and the darks, which we'll talk about it a bit later on. And you'll see different looks as we go through. And I would just work my way along, and all I'm doing is pressing the right arrow key on the keyboard. And as I go through, you can see just how bad a lot of the pictures are. And virtually all of these I would just be deleting as I go, because there's absolutely nothing there that's worth working on. So this is why I stressed in the video the need to take hundreds of pictures, not just 10, 20 or 30, because in all likelihood you could get home and all 10, 20 or 30 could be rubbish and you could end up deleting them all. You can see some are very, very abstract with hardly any definition.
Are you just working instinctively there about which ones might work and might not?
Yeah, I talked in the video about how I get a bit of a tingle, a bit of a sort of
Yeah.
an excited feeling when I see a picture that I feel has got something. I get that feeling when I look at the back of the camera, and so I'm waiting for that feeling again as I look at these pictures, as I scroll through them. And the vast majority do absolutely nothing for me, and so I just mark them with the X key generally, which will mark them for deletion. It won't delete them from the hard drive, but it just puts a reject flag, which helps me to search for them in future to delete them. So this gives you an idea that I won't go any further, but this just gives you an idea of the kind of rubbish, as you can see, that ICM produces. Most of it completely awful and unusable, but in amongst them, there are images that are exciting. So if I press the F key again, I go back to my normal view. So the reason I use the 4 stars is down here in the bottom right of the screen, you've got the star rating system down here. And if I click on the 4 stars, you can see the images now that I've marked with 4 stars. And here it tells me that on the afternoon we were out together, I took 270 photographs. And I've marked with 4 stars 35 of them. Now that's quite a high hit rate. And conditions were quite good on our afternoon out, so that's quite a high hit rate. I would expect normally out of 270 photographs to probably only have 10 maybe that had caught my eye, and out of those I'd probably only end up processing a couple. But 35 out of 270, that's quite a good hit rate. So now I've got 35 selected. I'll now go through them again, and I will look to see which ones really excite me out of these that I've narrowed down. So if you've got an earlier version of Lightroom, so pre-version 5, you won't be able to press the F key to get the picture full screen to do this, but another shortcut is to press the Shift and Tab key together, and that hides all of your panels, which is quite a nice shortcut. That gets rid of a lot of the clutter on the screen. And then if you press the L key twice, the screen goes black. So that's a workaround if you've got one of the earlier versions of Lightroom. And that gets rid of all the noise again, so you're now just focusing on the picture with no distractions, and I really like that. There's nothing on the screen to take my mind off the image, and I can really focus on the details. So now I'm just pressing the right arrow keys again, and I'm just looking at the ones that I've marked with 4 stars, and I'm looking for one that excites me. Okay, so let's take this one for example. So when I look at this, I like the colors. I like the amount of movement. There's enough distinction in the picture to see that it's silver birch trees that have caught the sunlight. The leaves have got a nice sort of shimmery effect to me. I quite like the layers of color, the bracken in the foreground with this sort of pale rusty color, contrasting nicely with the bright silver birch trunks and the greens. And then there's some sort of purpley blues as well going on, which was the light from the sky and the shadow areas. So let's say, for example, I decide that this is the one I'm going to have a go at processing. So now to come back to process it, I would press the Shift Tab key again, which brings all my panels back, and I press the L key once, and that just brings the lights back on and I can see what I'm doing. And I would go over into the Develop module by clicking on the Develop module button up here at the top of the screen. And then the next thing I always do when I'm working on a raw file, before I do anything else, is right click it and click create a virtual copy. And the reason for doing this is I like to leave my original raw file, which you can still see here, completely untouched. So I've always got that to go back to, and I can use that as a reference point. A virtual copy doesn't duplicate the raw file, so it's taking up almost no extra disk space. It's just created another entry in the Lightroom database that refers back to the raw file. So to us, it looks like we're working on a fresh copy of the picture, but it's not taking up any extra disk space. So that allows me to work on the picture without any worries about doing any damage to the raw file. Even though you've got the reset button and things like that, I do like to work on a virtual copy. And the very first thing I always do is I look at the crop of the image. And I think the crop tool in Lightroom is really useful. And the first thing that strikes me about this image is this central area. That's what's really catching my attention. And because I love square images, my gut feeling is to look and see whether there's a square image here. And I'll show you why I really like the crop tool in Lightroom as opposed to any other piece of software. Once you click on the crop tool here, you get the little toolbox drops down over on the right hand side. And beside the word original there, you can drop the arrow down, and if I click on 1:1, I get a perfect square crop. But then if I use the same shortcut we just used of Shift Tab, I hide all my panels, so now I'm seeing the picture as big as I can on the screen. And then if I press the L key twice again, I'm back to that uncluttered look. I'm now focusing just on the picture with no distractions. And the other brilliant thing about it is I can now start to move the picture around by clicking on it with my mouse. My cursor is a hand, and I can start to position the image within my square frame. And I can get hold of the edges, and I can start to move it around and get everything just as I like. And just to show you sort of how versatile it is, if, for example, we unlock the padlock here on the toolbox, so go back to as shot, so we're back to the full size, but take the padlock and make the padlock open by clicking on it. Now if I press Shift Tab and press the L key twice, you can start to move the crop completely freehand. You've got no constraints at all as to shape or size. So you can really start to play about with it and then move the picture around within the crop. And this uncluttered approach with no distractions on the screen and being able to move the picture around within the crop I find really useful. And I often find that there are pictures within the picture. And so actually, as I look at this now, and I'm doing this live, I quite liked the square crop, and I may well create 2 images from this one now, because I think the square crop really worked. But I'm quite liking this more panoramic crop as well. And so I think just for the sake of this demo, I'll go with this panoramic crop a little bit. And so what I'm looking at now is the balance of the image. I'd like to get the trees quite central. So I'm looking at the gap between the edge of the frame and the edge of the trees here, and then the trees to the edge of the frame here to get some sort of symmetry, which is a bit of a thing of mine. If I open the picture up a bit, I'm finding these lighter blue areas up here a little bit distracting. Although I love the colour, I think by just cropping them out and focusing in on the trees and these structures and colours here, I think the image is a little bit stronger. And so once I've got everything as I want it, and I'm just going to pull that in. Once I'm happy with that, just press the Enter key and the crop is accepted. And if now I press the L key, once the lights come back on, Shift Tab, and we get our image back with the panels. So I find the crop tool in Lightroom, when working like that, really very, very powerful indeed. I often use the grad tool. We might come on another image, might need that. We don't really need that with this image. I like the new radial filter tool in Lightroom 5. At the moment, I don't feel I need it. so I won't touch on that at the moment. But what I will go into now is this first panel on the right hand side in Lightroom. I work from the top down in Lightroom. This panel here really, with most things, is designed to work from the top down. And so the first thing I do is look at the white balance. And for me, especially with an image like an ICM image, white balance I view as a creative tool. I'm not looking for grey card white balance. I'm looking to make the picture look how I want it to look. And so you can get hold of the sliders and you can start to move these about and create all sorts of crazy things depending on how you want to go. And you can be quite extreme with those. With all the sliders in Lightroom, if you double click the little button, they will jump back to their original position. So if you do experiment and you make a complete mess, just double click the slider, it will pop back. So you don't have to worry about playing. You can really be experimental with it. You can also drop down this box here. You can click on daylight. That's what it would have looked like if the camera had shot on daylight, cloudy, and so on. So they're quite nice with those warm colors. But I'm going to go back to as shot. Equally, you can click on the pipette tool, take it over onto the picture, and as you move it around, if you notice up here on the navigator window, whatever pixel you're pointing at with the pipette changes the color, the white balance, and you'll see the change reflected in the navigator window in the top right. And so whatever you click on, the white balance will be changed according to whatever color you select. And so you can play with that if you like. So I'm just going to make this picture. Let's have a look. I'm just going to make it a little bit warmer. So I'm just taking the yellow, taking the blue yellow slider a little bit to the yellow. And I'm just going to take it a little bit more towards the green, perhaps. Okay, there we go. And leave that there. Another nice thing with Lightroom is down here at the bottom left of the screen, you've got a button which says YY on it. If you click on that, it'll show you before and after. So again, I will often click on that YY button to see how I'm doing and see whether if what I'm doing is making the picture better or worse. And once again, you can press Shift Tab on your keyboard, dim the lights, and again you can have an uncluttered view of what you're doing, and you can just see on the left where I started and then what I've done on the right, and you can ask yourself, is it getting any better or am I actually making things worse? And I think actually I'd probably put a little bit too much yellow in, so I'm just going to take a bit out there. Okay, just click back on the loop view button there and you go back to full size. I'm now going to adjust the tones of the picture, and this is a really key adjustment in classic landscape images as well as ICM images. The way I do it is to set the black and white point first. So I'm looking at the black and white sliders here. I hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and then click on the white slider. And as soon as you click on the white slider, the picture goes black. And then I start to move the slider slowly towards the right. I keep going until you get that pixel burn out there like that. Stop moving the slider and then slowly pull it back until those blown pixels disappear. Then stop moving the slider and release. And in theory, that's set the perfect white point. What I would always say is only do that if it makes the picture look better. Most pictures, it does make the picture look better, but sometimes it doesn't. So if it doesn't, position it where it makes the picture look good. Then I repeat with the black slider, but in this case, when you click on the slider with the Alt key held down, the picture goes white, and you move the black slider to the left until you get pixel burnout. Then pull it slowly back until those pixels disappear. Let go, and that in theory has set the perfect black point. I think that's a little bit too far, so I'm just going to pull it back towards the center a little bit more. With the shadows and highlights, move these sliders wherever you like. Just play with them and see what you think. And so you can add contrast or remove contrast depending on what you want to do. And so I'm just going to position these until I feel that things are looking good. Okay. I very rarely touch the exposure control, almost never, do sometimes, but very rarely. And I don't think I ever touch the contrast slider. They're global controls, and I find these controls do a much better job. So almost never touch the exposure, and I don't think I've ever used the contrast slider there. These are a much better way of controlling your contrast, much more targeted. The clarity slider, if I'm doing classic landscape work, is something I avoid at all costs. But with this kind of thing, I am prepared to use the clarity slider. And as you can see, by moving it to the left, you can add diffusion to the picture. By moving it to the right, you can bring out some structure and texture to the picture. With classic landscapes, it tends to be a bit of a destructive tool, to be honest. You've got to be a bit careful with it. But I think it's less important with ICM and this style of image. You've already sort of you've lost a lot of clarity and so on, so it's not having the same implications as it has with a classic landscape image. I tend to do my saturation, if I'm going to saturate at all, in the Nik plugin, the Viveza plugin. But there probably isn't time to touch on those in this webinar. So I would advise using the vibrant slider first if you want to add some saturation, some sort of overall saturation. It will tend to saturate the less saturated colors first, whereas the saturation slider saturates every pixel equally, and it's not often really that you want to do that. So certainly with classic landscape images, I tend to avoid vibrance and saturation almost always. I find that adding contrast usually provides enough saturation. With ICM and sort of these types of images, I do sometimes use saturation, and so I'd still urge a little bit of caution though. Don't be careful about overcooking it. What I would say is that you can do some very creative things in this hue, saturation and luminance panel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the vibrance and saturation sliders back to their original positions and just show you some of the things that you can do here with the hue, saturation and luminance. We're sort of familiar with saturation because we understand that that makes colors richer. But color has two other aspects to it as well. Luminance is the brightness of the color, and hue is the shade. And so Lightroom allows you to target these other areas of color as well as the saturation. And one of the nice things about the way Lightroom does it is it provides this little innocuous tool here on the left hand side. It's a tiny little dot, and if you click on it and pull your cursor over onto the screen, if I bring it up into this dark area, you might be able to see that your cursor becomes a target. Now if you click with that target on a color quite precisely and hold the mouse button down, the target disappears, but then start to move your mouse button upwards, up your desk, and that range of colors will start to saturate. And if you look over in the saturation panel on the right, you'll see the sliders have moved for the two channels that are affecting the colors on the pixels that I clicked on. And if I pull the mouse down, those color channels desaturate. And so you've got very precise control over certain colors in the image. So now I could click on the bracken, for example, and target those channels and add some saturation in on those channels if I wanted. And so the same applies with the hue. If I pick up on the hue, click on a color channel, and you can turn one color into another. If I push in the opposite direction, you'll go in the opposite direction. And so you can start to make pictures look quite different to the way they were when you shot them. And by precisely clicking on colours, you can alter things exactly to your taste. And if you click on luminance, you'll see that you can make colours brighter and more washed out, or darker and more sort of matte and subdued. And so again, you can start to alter the picture and get effects. A lot of these things you would cringe at doing to a classic landscape image, but to something like this, where we're being playful and being, where there are no rules, then you really have got no holes barred. And I would urge you just to experiment. And a lot of your experimentation will produce things that are totally awful. But occasionally you will just play with something and something really pleasing will happen, and you'll get a look that you really like. And you'll find that your familiarity with the controls will help you. You'll start to get a feel for what the controls do, and you'll start to get a look that you like. So I use those controls quite a bit to adjust the colors in the image, so you can really sort of home in on different color channels. You can also get hold of these sliders and just move these sliders about if you want, and just affect different color channels as well. But I find using this target tool is really very, very useful. Other effects down here, often with the with ICM images and many of my images, I do like a vignette. A lot of people don't like a vignette. A lot of people work very hard to get rid of vignetting with certain lenses, but I will use a vignette quite a bit, and so I will just play with this, and I usually have a lot of feather, and pull it back. And again, don't forget you can click on the Y button down here in the bottom left, Shift Tab, LL, and you can start to see the changes that you've made. And so you can decide whether the things you're doing are pleasing or not. Shift Tab and L again just brings you back to the normal view. A couple of other things to encourage playing with these images and experimenting, and ICM and these kind of alternative techniques really encourage us to be sort of playful and experimental, is to remember over here that on the history panel, whereas in Photoshop we've perhaps got it set in our preferences for 20 levels of undo or 50 levels of undo, with Lightroom we have an infinite undo panel, and so we can go back to any point we like in the picture's development, just click and it will take us back to that point, and it retains all the steps, so you can click backwards and forwards, so you can see whether what you're doing is making things better or worse, and you can go backwards and forwards and check what you're doing, and you can undo to any level. So even a tiny tweak of one slider is recorded by Lightroom. So that encourages us to experiment. Also, if we get to a point with our picture and we think, well, I really like where I am now, but I want to try something, but I'm worried that I'm going to make a mess of the picture, then just click this plus button beside the word snapshots, and we get a snapshot button come up. We can just use the date and time stamp, or we can give it a name. We can just call it the good bit or whatever you like, and click create, and the snapshot is saved. You can then go on and experiment and do some crazy things, and then you might think, yeah, I've made a terrible mess of it. Well, just click back on the snapshot and it takes the picture straight back to that point in time. And you can have as many snapshots as you like. So you might do another 5 minutes work, and then you might think, well, I'm happy with where I am. And you can then create another snapshot because you want to push a bit harder and take the picture further. And you can click between the snapshots and flip between them to see whether what you're doing is getting better or worse. So I really like this facility to help you, to give you the confidence to go backwards and forwards and to experiment and to see if what you're doing is actually helping you make progress, or whether things are going the wrong direction or not. And of course, if all else fails, you've got the reset button down here in the bottom right. So that will strip the file right back to the bare raw file again. So you can always do that if you like.
Do you use presets for?
I don't, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
A lot of photographers do. Lightroom comes with a load of presets, and you might find that you create a look that you really like. You might have a really nice black and white conversion, or you might create a really nice color balance, or whatever you like. All you have to do is click add a preset there and give it a title, and then just tick whichever boxes in this section here for the settings you want to preserve. And then the next time you want to apply those settings in one click to the picture, you just click on that preset, and so it will just do it. And with these presets here over on the left hand side of the screen, you can see in the navigator window, as I move my cursor down the presets that are there, these are black and white ones. Let's go to some color ones that Photoshop gives us. You can see the navigator window in the top left of the screen changing, and that's just giving you a look at what the picture would look like. So if I click on that cross process 3, it applies those settings in one click. If you don't like them, press Command Z or Control Z in Windows, and it undoes it in one go as well. So again, it's not an irreversible change. I tend to find I process each image as a one-off. The time I perhaps would use presets is if I was preparing a triptych, for example. So a set of images that I was planning to hang together. You can clear everything off the screen and just see the image without any distractions. And for me, that's looking okay. So I press Command S or Control S in Windows. That just saves it now as a TIFF. And if I close it and go back to Lightroom, there it is waiting for me. That's the raw file there with the raw changes. And there's the TIFF now, just with the slight changes we made to the TIFF file. So for me, once it's loaded up, it's going to be very pixelated. Just give my system time to catch up. Hopefully. If I do this way, anyway. So that would be my finished image. How does that look to you? Give me a quick critique.
So losing your audio a little bit, Doug.
Give me a critique. What do you reckon?
It looks very nice. It's amazing, having seen the original image, what a difference it makes. Especially with how flat the original images looked.
So I've gone quite hard with this, with contrast, colour, and so on. So I've actually quite hard. It's one of the reasons we should more of it. If I go back to the original picture, and you look at how flashed out it is. I think if I go into the mind, and I click on X1, Shift tab. Now you can see the two images together. So you have to have enough, I think, sort of foresight for where you can take the image. And this is where, I think getting that buzz initially, seeing the structure and the colours there, and having an idea of what you can pull out of that, and trusting the raw file, the colours that are there and so on. And not being frightened, because I would never push a classic landscape like I've pushed this. I've been outrageous with this picture, but you just wouldn't do this with a classic landscape file. But I don't believe there are any rules when you're doing this kind of thing. All I'm interested in is the final image. It's a creative process, and so that's what I'm after, really. And you can see several versions. You can see here how moving the camera at different speeds has affected the image, and how the same scene can produce quite different effects, more diffused, softer colours, right out to things that are much more structured, and that have got more sort of bite in them. But for some reason, there's still a little bit of the light has held on. So it must be the amount of camera movement has permitted a little bit of the light still to show through. So it shows how camera movement can affect the image. So it gives you a sort of a feel for it. So if shall I just have a go at processing one of these, just to sort of,
Yeah.
I'll give a sort of a quick run through. So
It
go
looks like
straight
there's
into.
not looks like there's not as much scope for applying the contrast. These aren't as flat or low
No,
contrast to the
there's
ICM
already a bit
pictures.
of there's already a bit of sort of work done by the camera because it's already blended pixels together. It has started to process the image in camera, and so there perhaps isn't the scope. So I'm just I'll do a bit of a panoramic type crop, and I'm going to do this at sort of speed really, for the sake of time. I'm just going to have a little look at white balance. And you see that's interesting how that's just brought up purples a bit more, and that the heather was very sort of deep purpley blue when we were there.
Yes.
And so let's just have a look at that. I'm just going to now quickly do the highlights. This will be interesting actually to see if we get any highlight information. That's probably made it too bright. This is where I would say, be careful with don't always be slavish to black points and white points with this. Okay, come down to my hue, saturation, luminance, and let's just see what we can do here. So maybe just to bring up some of these autumn colors a little bit more. Ooh, tiger. Don't want to go too crazy. Just bring up that. And let's just see what we do. So all I'm doing is using the saturation tool, and I'm just clicking on different colors in the picture and moving my mouse up just to sort of punch up the colors a little bit. Let's just see what the my mouse connection wants to come back. Mouse. All right, just have a look at changing the hue of that bracken in the foreground. I remember it as being much more sort of deep purple to our eyes when we were there. So I'm going to reflect that in the way I process it.
It's interesting how you're quite happy to change hues, like you say, which you might
Wouldn't
do subtly in
dream of
a
being
real
extreme like
landscape
this.
image.
No. I'd shudder to do anything like this. Let's just try. No, I'm not going to mess about with the clarity. I'm just going to go very quickly in, and I'm just playing with the vignetting, big feather, changing the roundness, slight vignette. Okay, I'm going to come back up and I'm going to add highlight, and I'm going to just okay, and I'm going to touch my exposure slider, which I don't normally do. I'm quite liking this pool of light that I'm getting here in the center. So I'm going to go in there with the tool here, just to just move this around and open it up and just try and bring a bit of light, a bit more light through here. And so if I just invert the mask, I have to make this quite a bit bigger. Let's close that a bit. I'm going to increase the exposure a bit more. Okay, right, I'm going to take this quickly over into Viveza for the colors. So this is the Nick plugin. This will change the raw file now into a TIFF.
Why do you
Viveza,
use Viveza for color saturation? It's interest.
yeah, I use it because I prefer the way it handles color to Photoshop or Lightroom, if I'm honest. Um, I think the maths running underneath it is, I don't know, it seems to handle color better than either Lightroom or Photoshop for me.
Okay.
And it has some nice controls. If you're used to the Nick plugins, you'll be used to the control points. I won't use the control points here, but I find the brightness control is really good. It adds a nice natural brightness, and I find the saturation is more natural. And I do like, it's got a warmth slider, which if I apply it, and if I go and touch the split screen button, I like the way you can drag this split screen slider across. Can you see how that is just showing you the before and after?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to pull that back a bit. I'm doing this very quickly now, really. Probably overdoing it a bit. And the shadow adjustments is very good as well, for opening up shadows or just pulling some nice sort of dark shadow areas in if you just want to add a bit of sort of selective contrast into the deeper areas of the picture. So once you've made your changes, I'm just doing this very quickly. I'm going to click Save. And that will take it back straight back into Lightroom as a TIFF. Boom, there we go, as a TIFF. Okay.
So that's created a duplicate of the file, has it?
Duplicate the file. So there's our raw file. I forgot to create a virtual copy of it. There I've added a bit more saturation to the picture. If I just go there you go, full screen. It's taking a while to load up. Let me do it the other way around. Shift tab.
Out of interest, if you've got 30 pictures back from a session like this, would you play around with a few of them to this extent to see what they look like? I mean, how many would you tend to have a look at?
What I do is I've got over here in collections, I've got to create a collection called To Process, and you'll see there it's got 1,307 images in it, waiting for me to process them.
Not foreboding at all.
So all of these 4-star images would get dragged into there, and then when I've got time to do processing, I go into that collection, flick through it, find one that grabs me at that moment, and I process that one picture. And as you can see, I'm way behind. Every winter at the end of the year, I do a sort of a cull of my pictures, and loads of those will get deleted, and I narrow it down. And that does help me to be much more selective with the images that I process. And it also means that I don't usually process now pictures soon after I've taken them. Often months or sometimes even years go by before I process them, and I'm finding a benefit in that. So if I take 30 on a day like this, which is a high hit rate for ICM, believe you me, I may end up ultimately processing 2 or 3 of these. But I might start processing 5 or 6, but get to a point with 2 or 3 of them and then think, no, this is rubbish, I'm not happy with it, and I'll just abort it. I don't keep forcing it. If an image doesn't work,
it's one of the things I think I've noticed is it's quite difficult to judge the picture without having some contrast applied to it, possibly.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, some of these here, you see something like that is very, very abstract. There's hardly any detail in it, but I think there might be something there. That would be quite a speculative one for me to process because there's very little detail there. But I've identified that there might be something. Whereas you get one maybe like this, where there's a lot more detail, there's almost certainly an image here. You know, straight away I can see that by doing a crop, I can start to see an image coming together straight away. And
Yeah.
I would happily work on that now, and sort of start to put an image together. So
Well, we've been getting a few questions in. If you don't mind me passing them on to you from
absolutely,
people.
yeah, happy to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Ian Coles has asked, is he presumes that noise reduction and sharpening tools are effectively redundant when processing ICM.
Noise reduction, maybe you might use noise reduction, but the thing is, it would be, you don't tend to get noisy images because generally you're working at like that. Um, that would,
Would you play around using larger radiuses as well to try and create
yeah,
more of
possibly,
this
yeah.
movement?
And also, I use the Nick output sharpening plugin, and with that you've got control points, so it might be that I selectively sharpen certain areas of the picture, or if I was sharpening in Photoshop I would do it with layer masks and selectively sharpen the areas that had structure in them, whereas the
Yeah,
areas that were quite diffuse I would leave unsharpened.
yeah, and presumably the same for clarity, using local clarity adjustments.
Exactly, yeah, yeah, exactly the same.
Yeah. Mark Simpson asks about lens chromatic aberration corrections, and presumably the same goes for things like perspective adjustments.
Yeah, I've never had to do a perspective adjustment.
No.
Chromatic aberration, yeah, again, if it was an issue, I would certainly use it. My workflow generally is create a virtual copy and apply um, the lens profile and the chromatic aberration tick boxes in the lens corrections box. I do that with all my classic landscapes. In reality, sometimes I forget when I'm doing ICM, but there would be no
Yeah.
harm in applying those because chromatic aberration could be an issue, I suppose, but less so with an image like this.
Yeah. Paul Chambers asks, is there any difference saving as TIFF or PSD from
None
Lightroom?
at all, really. I flatten all my images. I don't go back and tinker with them. Either, if you like to preserve your layers, both formats preserve the layers. But I don't really think there's any benefits either way, or negatives either way, whichever you prefer. I work in TIFFs. That's just the way I've always worked.
Yeah. And Glyn K says, do you worry about loading Lightroom up with a lot of TIFFs?
Not at all. No, I cull my libraries down. So, um, I'm a professional photographer, and my Lightroom library has, at the end of this year, will probably only have around 22,000 images in it, and that's 8 years of digital and film photography. I only keep images that are worth keeping. I'm ruthless at getting rid of the rubbish. I'm not in the
Yeah.
business of making flick books of sunrises and so on.
Yeah.
If I've taken a beautiful image of a sunrise and then there was 20 other shots of that sunrise, there will only be one image which is the absolute best, and that's the one I'll keep. And there's no point in keeping all the others as far as I'm concerned. So I'm quite hard on getting rid of all the rubbish that nobody will ever look at. But Lightroom won't slow down. Lightroom will chew through libraries of 250,000 images or more with no trouble at all, as
Yeah.
long as your computer's up to it.
Um, a question from Susan Brown and Damien Taylor, and I think also I have to doubly check, is with your Canon 5D Mark III, the multiple exposure
Mm.
system is built into it. If you want
Yeah.
to do it using a 5D Mark II and just take lots of exposures and to blend them, have you ever done that, and is it fairly straightforward? Does it produce the same result?
You can do it using the blending modes in Photoshop in the layers panel, but it is very tricky and it doesn't do it the same way as the camera does it.
Yes.
I've experimented with it, and if you look at the work of Rob Hudson, particularly his Songs of Travel series, which are beautiful, he has developed a way of combining a large number of images often. Um, he converts them to black and white and blends them together. I don't know exactly how he does it, and he gets a beautiful soft effect with the technique that he uses. But I haven't had a lot of success. You certainly can do it, but you won't get exactly the same effect that the 5D Mark III gives you. But what I would say is that doesn't mean that the images won't be any good. It will just give you something that's different. And so if you haven't got the 5D Mark III, don't feel you've got to go out and buy one. If I couldn't afford the 5D Mark III, I would have carried on with the 5D Mark II and done exactly that.
Yeah,
I would have
well,
experimented and played and worked out a technique and developed one. So, by all means, have a go. That's what I would encourage.
well, because there is some interest in this, I think it might be worth. We'll write a short article about it, how to do that in Photoshop. I mean, for
Okay,
people
yeah.
who don't have even a Canon camera. Um, got a question on once you've processed your image, is cropping the same in Lightroom? Um, so does it make any difference? Can you crop afterwards after you've done the post processing?
You can, but for me, cropping is so important. I think I have to do it first because it's absolutely crucial to me to see the image um, in balance, and it has such an effect on the composition, which I think then has an effect on how the image looks as a finished image. So I can't imagine cropping later very often, if I'm honest. I think I would definitely crop first and get the composition and the whole balance of the image right first. Then I would go on and process it. But there aren't any rules, so if it works for you, then I would then carry on doing it.
Yeah. Penny Campbell says, which direction would you take if you wanted to produce more ethereal results? And I presume asking about whether it's ICM or longer exposures or multiple exposure, etc.
So to make an image more ethereal, more dreamy, with less definition, in camera you want to go for a longer exposure, more camera movement, um, and then in processing you want to do things like moving the clarity slider to the left in Lightroom, um, anything to sort of take structure away, perhaps experimenting with the Gaussian blur filter or the other blur filters, and sort of again taking detail out, or maybe experiment with laying one photograph on top of another and experimenting with blending modes. There's no rules why the two photographs have to be taken on the same day even. Blend one photograph taken one day into another photograph taken another day, and sort of see how that works.
And
But
that brings us
you're
on
looking
to
for
a
an
point.
absence of sharpness, really.
We'll be looking at texturing photographs, in fact, combining multiple photographs for a texturing effect in a future
Yeah,
webinar or article, won't we, Doug? So
we will.
we can perhaps look a little bit at that then. Well, thank you very much, Doug, for that. That was brilliant, and it's great watching some of the pictures come past at the bottom of the screen here. If anybody's got any questions afterwards, just drop us an email or pass us a comment via social media. We're sorry for some of the audio dropping out in the middle of the seminar. I think the GoToWebinar had a couple of problems for a few minutes. We have a webinar in January. David Breen and Dav Thomas will be doing the next webinar on the 14th of January, and that's another blind critique. But for now, I'll say a very big thank you for everybody that's turned up, and a big thank you for Doug Chinnery for giving the webinar.
That's okay. Pleasure.